Imagine a civilization that endured for more than 2,000 years, not just surviving, but shaping the rhythm of life for nearly a quarter of the human population. Imperial China wasn't merely a sequence of dynasties and emperors. It was a living, breathing continuity of thought, order, and meaning. Through invasions, uprisings, golden ages, and dark winters of chaos, something held it all together, an invisible thread that stitched the empire's heart to its mind. That thread was Confucianism. Not merely a philosophy in the academic sense, not just a dusty collection of sayings in an ancient book. Confucianism was something deeper. It was a blueprint for how to be human in the context of family, of society, of the universe itself. It whispered of harmony, of duty, of a quiet kind of excellence that didn't need applause. And in the halls of power, it offered more than wisdom. It offered legitimacy, structure, and moral gravity. In this video, we'll trace the roots of Confucianism from the life of one man named Confucius to its rise as the soul of statecraft under the Han Dynasty. We'll walk through the civil service that turned scholars into statesmen, and explore how Confucian ideals shaped everything from family dynamics to imperial authority. We'll meet its rivals, see it bend without breaking, and even follow its uncertain steps into the modern world. But before we dive into how Confucianism built an empire, let us begin where all meaningful stories do. Not with conquest or command, but with a quiet voice offering a question. What does it mean to live rightly? To understand Confucianism, we have to travel back to a time of deep uncertainty. The Spring and Autumn period, an era in ancient China marked not by harmony, but by fragmentation. The Zhou dynasty had lost its grip, and regional warlords vied for power as the once sacred mandate of heaven seemed to flicker and fade. Chaos wasn't just political, it was moral. Rituals had lost their meaning. Authority had lost its virtue. And in the midst of this unraveling, a man was born who would offer not rebellion, but remembrance. His name was Confucius, Confucius. Born in 551 BCE, he was not a ruler, nor a prophet, nor a general. He was a teacher, a seeker, a man who believed that the path forward lay in remembering what it meant to be fully human. And so he taught, not in edicts, but in conversations. Not in commands, but in questions. The essence of his teachings would later be compiled by his disciples into a work called the Analects, a quiet, powerful record of his vision. At the heart of it all was Ren, often translated as benevolence or humanness. For Confucius, Ren was the heartbeat of a virtuous life, the ability to feel with others, to act with kindness, to see the other as an extension of oneself. But feeling wasn't enough. Feeling needed form. That's where Li came in, ritual propriety, the structured behaviors that preserved order, respect, and harmony. Whether in mourning, in governance, or in daily speech, Li was the sacred choreography of a society in balance. Then came Jiao, filial piety, reverence for one's parents, elders, and ancestors. Not as obedience for its own sake, but as a reflection of cosmic order. The family, after all, was a mirror of the state. A society that honored its roots could grow with dignity. And finally, there was the Junzi, the superior person. Not superior by birth, but by cultivation. A person refined through learning, moral reflection, and self-discipline. This was Confucius's hero. Not a warrior, but a sage. Someone who led not with fear, but with virtue. Yet in his lifetime, Confucius was not celebrated. He moved from court to court, offering his counsel to rulers who often ignored him. His dream of a morally restored state seemed more like a gentle echo than a rallying cry. But echoes have a way of lasting. Though his influence would not rise immediately, the seeds he planted of virtue over violence, of order over ambition, of wisdom over brute strength, would one day take root in the heart of an empire. And as we step forward into that transformation, we begin to see how a forgotten teacher would come to define what it meant to govern with a soul. By the time the Han Dynasty rose to power, China had been wounded deeply by the authoritarian grip of the Qin. The Qin had unified the land, yes, but at a cost. Harsh laws, brutal punishments, and a legalist philosophy that saw people as tools to be managed, not souls to be guided. So when the Han emerged from the ashes of that short-lived regime, the question was not just how to govern, but how to heal. And it was in this moment, this quiet yearning for something more humane, that Confucianism stepped from the shadows into the light. Emperor Wu of Han, who ruled from 141 to 87 BCE, made a bold choice. He recognized that power built on fear could conquer, but it could not endure. What the empire needed wasn't more laws, it was moral depth. So he did something unprecedented. He elevated Confucianism from wandering wisdom to state doctrine. Not simply a philosophy now, but the very soul of governance. To give this vision structure, Emperor Wu turned to a scholar named Dong Zhongshu. Dong was no ordinary academic. He was a visionary who saw the cosmos itself as a moral order. He believed that heaven, earth, and humanity were bound in a sacred triad, with the emperor as the vital link between the will of heaven and the fate of the people. Confucian ethics, he argued, weren't just good ideas. They were cosmic laws. The emperor's virtue was not optional. It was destiny. When a ruler governed justly, the heavens smiled. When he ruled with cruelty, even the winds and stars recoiled. This cosmic Confucianism gave the Han court both legitimacy and accountability. And with it came institutions that would shape Chinese civilization for centuries. The most powerful of these was the founding of the Imperial Academy, a school where young men studied the Confucian classics, not just to become learned, but to become leaders. Here, the seeds were sown for a new kind of bureaucracy, one built on merit, not bloodline. The civil service examination system began to take root, an idea radical for its time. Governance would not belong solely to aristocrats or warriors, but to those who could master virtue and express it in word and deed. This moment, when Confucianism became state orthodoxy, was more than a policy shift. It was the birth of a new moral architecture. Education became sacred, scholarship became service, and the empire itself began to imagine governance not as control, but as cultivation. And so, with Confucianism etched into the bones of the Han state, a new era unfolded. An era where power and principle were no longer at odds, but intertwined. As we journey deeper, we'll see how this sacred marriage between virtue and administration gave rise to a new kind of public servant, the scholar official. Once Confucianism was embraced as the heart of the Han government, it began to shape not just the emperor's court, but the very nature of public service itself. And nowhere was this influence more profound than in the creation of the civil service examination system, a doorway not just into a career, but into a calling. Imagine a society where political authority wasn't handed down through bloodlines or seized by military might, but earned through years of study, reflection, and moral cultivation. That was the promise at the core of the Confucian state. It wasn't a perfect meritocracy, but it was radical in spirit. Because in this world, the ruler's most trusted advisors were expected to be not conquerors, but scholars, men who had internalized the virtues of Confucius and could apply them in the messy reality of governance. At the center of this vision were the Confucian classics, the Analects, the Book of Rites, the Book of History, and others. These weren't just texts to memorize, but moral landscapes to inhabit. To pass the imperial exams, a candidate had to demonstrate not only literary skill, but ethical depth. He had to show that he understood what it meant to govern with wisdom, to listen with humility, to lead with restraint. And from this system emerged a powerful new class, the Shai, or scholar gentry. They were the bureaucratic backbone of the empire, officials, magistrates, educators, and advisors who carried Confucian ideals into every corner of society. Their identity wasn't forged in battle, but in ink. Their authority didn't come from a sword, but from a sense of responsibility to both the state and the people. This shift marked a quiet revolution, because in a world that often revered strength, Confucian China elevated something softer, but perhaps even more enduring: virtue. A scholar official was expected to be courageous, yes, but with moral courage, to speak truth to power when needed, to put loyalty to principle above loyalty to the throne. And yet, idealism rarely walks alone for long. Over time, even the noble architecture of the examination system faced the slow erosion of real-world complexities. Ambition crept in. Corruption took root. Families began to groom generations of sons not for service, but for status. The lines blurred between true moral cultivation and mere academic performance. Still, the spirit of the system lingered. In its purest form, it was a promise that wisdom and virtue could be cultivated, and that government, at its best, could be a mirror of the moral order. But as we move forward, we begin to see that Confucianism's influence wasn't limited to courtrooms or exams. It flowed deeper, into the structure of everyday life, into the family, into the rituals of respect, into the very way people understood their place in the world. To truly understand how Confucianism shaped the soul of Imperial China, we must leave the palace and enter the home. Because for Confucius, the foundation of the state was not the military or the market, but the family. And in the way a household was ordered, he saw the blueprint for all of society. At the heart of this vision were the 5 relationships: ruler and subject, father and son, husband and wife, elder and younger, and friend to friend. These were not just social pairings, they were sacred arrangements. Each carried a set of responsibilities, a flow of duty and deference, love and loyalty. And while modern ears might hear hierarchy, Confucius heard harmony. When each person fulfilled their role with sincerity and respect, the world fell into balance. Filial piety, xiao, was the cornerstone. To honor one's parents was not just personal virtue, it was public service. A son who revered his father would grow to serve his ruler with that same reverence. The family, in this sense, was the moral training ground for citizenship. But this structure also came with rigidity. Patriarchy wasn't just cultural, it was philosophical. The role of women, though valued in theory, was framed in terms of obedience and sacrifice. A daughter obeyed her father, a wife her husband, a widow her son. Confucianism didn't create these gender roles, but it offered them a kind of cosmic legitimacy. They were seen not as social constructs, but as expressions of natural order. And holding all of this together was ritual propriety. In the Confucian world, daily life was imbued with ceremony. How one greeted a guest, poured tea, mourned the dead, or addressed an elder, none of it was casual. Rituals weren't empty performances. They were spiritual alignments. They reminded each person of their place, not in the sense of subjugation, but of contribution. Everyone had a role to play in the orchestra of harmony. Yet, as time moved forward, not everyone heard this music the same way. Some questioned whether order always meant justice. Others challenged the notion that obedience could coexist with inner freedom. The structure that brought stability also raised tensions, questions that would emerge more fully as new philosophies entered the conversation. Because Confucianism, while deeply rooted, was never frozen. It would soon meet rival worldviews, spiritual, mystical, foreign, and from those encounters, it would begin to stretch, evolve, and even reinvent itself. No philosophy, no matter how deeply rooted, stands alone forever. Even Confucianism, so foundational to the Chinese state, so woven into its family life and rituals, was not immune to challenge. In fact, some of its most profound transformations came not from within, but from the pressure of alternatives. When the Han Dynasty fell, China entered a period of political fragmentation and spiritual searching. The old institutions wavered. The old certainties crumbled. And in this space of uncertainty, two powerful traditions surged into popular consciousness: Taoism and Buddhism. Taoism had always been close at hand, a homegrown counterpoint to Confucian structure. Where Confucius spoke of duty, Taoism whispered of surrender. It taught that the universe flowed not by force, but by harmony with the Tao, the way. It invited contemplation, stillness, and a return to nature. In a time when institutions collapsed, its message resonated. Then came Buddhism, carried across trade routes from India and transformed in Chinese soil. It spoke of suffering, impermanence, and inner liberation. In contrast to Confucianism's focus on earthly duty, Buddhism pointed toward transcendence. Monasteries rose, sutras were translated, and in troubled dynasties like the Wei Jin and the Six Dynasties, Confucianism lost its dominance. The state no longer looked to the Junzi alone. It turned to monks and mystics, seekers and sages. But Confucianism, rather than fading, waited. And in time, it adapted. During the Song dynasty, a new voice rose to the surface. Zhu Xi, a scholar, yes, but also a synthesizer. He saw the power in Buddhism's inner cultivation, in Taoism's metaphysical depth, and he folded them into a reinvigorated Confucian framework. Thus was born Neo-Confucianism, not a rejection of its rivals, but a transformation through them. It reasserted Confucian values, but deepened them with cosmological insight and spiritual nuance. This ability to evolve was no accident. Confucianism had always held a quiet flexibility beneath its structured surface. It could retreat when the world rejected it, but it could also return, clearer, stronger, more resonant when the time was right. Its endurance, then, was not simply because it offered order. It was because it carried a timeless question. How should we live, even when the world falls apart? As we move into the next chapter of this story, we'll see how Confucianism not only shaped personal virtue and family life, but also defined the very authority of emperors, making them not just rulers, but stewards of heaven's will. For Confucianism, power was never its own justification. A ruler was not divine by default, nor supreme by blood alone. His legitimacy had to be earned, not through conquest, but through virtue. This is where one of Confucianism's most enduring ideas emerges: the mandate of heaven. Heaven, in this philosophy, was not a god, but a moral force. It blessed the ruler who governed with justice and compassion. But that blessing was not eternal. It could be withdrawn. Natural disasters, famines, uprisings, these weren't just random misfortunes. They were signs, warnings that the emperor had lost his way. The throne, then, was a trust, not a possession. This is why the emperor was expected to be more than a political figure. He was a moral exemplar. His personal conduct was seen as a reflection of the cosmic balance. His self-discipline shaped the tone of the entire state. Rule by virtue, not by fear. That was the Confucian ideal. And yet, this ideal didn't mean unchecked power. Ministers had a sacred duty to speak truth to the throne, even when it was dangerous. This practice, known as remonstrance, was a deeply Confucian form of courage. A good ruler listened. A wise one welcomed correction. A state built on virtue depended on voices willing to challenge it. But here lies the paradox. As dynasties aged, especially during the Ming and Qing, these ideals often collided with the reality of autocracy. Emperors became more isolated, more absolute. Confucian rhetoric remained, but sometimes only as a mask worn over fear and control. The language of virtue was used to justify brutality. Dissent was no longer welcomed, but punished. And so, the very philosophy that sought to humanize power was now caught in a quiet struggle between the soul of the state and the machinery of rule. It is in this space, between moral aspiration and political pragmatism, that later dynasties would begin to falter. When ideals were hollowed out and form outlived substance, Confucianism itself would be questioned. And yet, it wouldn't disappear. As we approach the modern era, we'll witness the decline, suppression, and surprising revival of this ancient philosophy, reminding us that even in its most contested form, Confucianism has never stopped searching for the better self. By the early 20th century, the world that Confucianism had quietly guided for millennia was collapsing. The Qing dynasty, China's last imperial house, fell under the weight of internal decay and foreign humiliation. In its place rose something more volatile, more urgent, a modern China wrestling with identity, freedom, and survival. For reformers and revolutionaries, Confucianism became an easy target. It was blamed for China's stagnation, its submission to hierarchy, its resistance to innovation. The May 4th movement of 1919, led by students and intellectuals, wasn't just a political awakening, it was a cultural rebellion. Confucius, once venerated as a sage, was now criticized as a symbol of feudal oppression. His teachings, they said, kept China chained to the past. Then came the Maoist era. During the Cultural Revolution, Confucian temples were desecrated, texts were burned, statues smashed. The message was clear. Confucianism had no place in the new revolutionary China. The old order, with its rituals and reverence, was swept aside by the tides of ideology. And yet, not all roots die in the storm. In the decades that followed Mao's death, as China opened up to the world and began reimagining itself, something unexpected happened. Confucianism began to stir again. Not in temples alone, but in classrooms, in political discourse, even in state-sponsored institutions. The rise of Confucius institutes across the globe wasn't just about language. It was about identity, cultural pride, a reclaiming of something ancient, something uniquely Chinese. Today, political leaders speak of harmony and moral leadership. Scholars revisit Confucian texts with fresh eyes. And in the public imagination, Confucianism is no longer simply the philosophy of emperors. It's a bridge between past and present, between tradition and global modernity. Its journey reminds us that true wisdom is rarely static. It bends, it breaks, it returns. Confucianism endures not because it is infallible, but because it asks timeless questions in ever-changing times. And so, as we arrive at the final stretch of our journey, we must ask, what is the legacy of a philosophy that once ruled empires, was cast aside, and yet rises again, not as nostalgia, but as a mirror to who we are and who we hope to become? When we look back across the vast tapestry of Imperial China, we don't just see the rise and fall of dynasties. We see a moral rhythm, a quiet thread that held it all together. Confucianism shaped more than government policies or school curriculums. It formed the heartbeat of a civilization. In palaces and peasant homes alike, it taught people how to live, how to lead, how to listen, to one another and to something higher. It's rare for a philosophy to so gracefully bridge the personal and the political. But Confucianism did just that. It offered a vision of governance rooted in virtue, a model of social order based on respect, and a sense of cultural identity grounded not in conquest, but in character. It blended ethics with administration, ritual with responsibility. And yet, it was never without tension. The same structure that brought stability could, at times, calcify into rigidity. The hierarchy that fostered harmony also silenced dissent. The rituals that shaped meaning sometimes became empty shells. But through every challenge, Confucianism endured, adapting, retreating, returning. Because in the end, Confucianism wasn't just a tool of empire. It was the soul through which that empire dreamed, ruled, and remembered itself. And maybe that's its most powerful legacy. Not its perfection, but its persistence. The way it continues to ask us even now, not just how to build a state, but how to become truly human within it.